So, how can we continue after such a very inspiring panel? Thank you, Commissioner El Fadil. Thank you, Michael, for a very inspiring panel, which sets the stage, I hope, for another panel where we will focus on one area in Africa. My name is Martijn Pluim. I'm Director of Migration Dialogues and Cooperation in ICMPD. And I'm joined here by Mr. Vincent Cochetel, Special Envoy for the Central Mediterranean for the UN High Commissioner for Refugees. The Central Mediterranean is a region which has, for the last 2 decades, seen thousands of people killed, hundreds of thousands of people moving there. And it has been the region which has influenced a lot of the policy making, a lot of the decision making in Europe, from the Joint Valletta Action Plan adopted by the heads of state in 2015 to even the Migration Pact that has been adopted recently has been very much inspired by the events of the Central Mediterranean, and the attention has been very much to the north of Africa, to the northern borders, let's say, of the North African countries. Much less is being spoken about the southern borders, about the southern borders of Libya and other countries where we have seen many of the events happening. And I would like to focus this session on that border. Vincent, just as an introduction for the audience, would it be possible for you to maybe give a glance of what's happening there and how does it affect mobility, migration, and indeed also protection questions?
Thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me to share some observation with you today. Yeah, there's been a lot of focus on the maritime border of Libya in particular, 1,700 kilometers of coastal line. There's been much less focus on the 2,400 kilometers of land borders with the 6 neighbors, the largest border being with Sudan, with Chad, with Algeria. And we tend to forget that 70% of the migrants in Libya, which is about 600,000 people, 70% of the migrants are coming from the 6 neighboring countries. And they are working there, 80% of them are working there, they have reached their final destination. We have this myth in Europe that they all want to cross the Mediterranean Sea. No, Libya is attracting people from neighboring countries and will continue to attract people because of its labor needs. So I think we need to keep that in mind. Now, in terms of flows, the majority of the flows into Libya today come from Niger, still 50%, in spite of the efforts of the Niger government. And then they are coming through the land border from Egypt, from Chad, and from Sudan. Entry from Tunisia and Algeria are very marginal. So those movements are made possible because of a flourishing trafficking economy on both sides of the border. I think we have armed groups. We have 3 Chadian opposition armed groups based in southern Libya. We have 3 Sudanese armed groups based in southern Libya, plus elements of the rapid support force also that are associated with some criminal gangs there. Some of those armed groups have been recruited as mercenaries on both sides of the civilian war. Now we have the problem of demobilization because they pose security risk for Libya, but as we've seen in Chad last year, they also pose serious security problem for countries in the region. So we need to solve that problem through classic demobilization, demilitarization, possibly amnesty, but we're going to have to look at those issues.
Thank you. Thank you. I think that shows already now the complexity of the challenges that all countries in the region are being confronted with. Now, for a second, let's stay a little bit still at the northern border. We have seen that there's been quite a number of changes in routes. There are objectives of the migrants, some looking for protection, some for economic reasons. And the EU and Europe at large has sought several approaches to address the flows to the southern coast. And from strengthening search and rescue to border management capacities, discussing disembarkation platforms, supporting upstream interventions to address root causes. There is a discussion on further modernization and professionalization of the migration agencies in North African countries. Indeed, Malta will soon launch a Mediterranean Training Initiative. But with all this combination of interventions that there are, which ones have you seen, based on your several decades of experience, which of these interventions could work, which combination could work? Again, as the Commissioner said, we don't talk about finding the one golden solution. We all know that that doesn't exist in migration, but what initiative deserve more attention in your perspective?
Well, thank you very much. And it's difficult to speak after Commissioner Al-Fadil. She said it much more eloquently. I think I'm quite surprised that in Europe there are very few countries referring back to the Valletta Plan of Action. It was agreed language with partners in Africa. It was comprehensive. It's 5 pillars, and every country can find something of interest. I think we need to make sure that the approach remains focused on that agreed language, and we don't need more initiatives. I totally join Commissioner Al-Fadil on that one. So some project or some communication sometimes have been a bit clumsy. You know, when we talked about disembarkation platform, processing center in African countries, it's like if nothing exists. I mean, we have large refugee population in Chad, in Sudan, in Niger that are managed by the government with the support of the international community and international organization. 90% of the refugees are staying in those countries. And they are large communities. So let's not forget that. Let's not forget the efforts that are made in place. Let's concentrate on what is needed in terms of stabilization for everybody, for the host communities, for the people themselves. It's probably more easy with the refugee because we know better their needs than for migrants who have more diverse needs in terms of mobility than refugees. Refugees would like to go back home when and if possible. That's different for migrants sometimes.
Yes. So from the concrete actions that you have seen, I understood also the way of working, let's say, in partnership with the countries, like what we had in some areas. We have this twinning approach, building up capacities, listening very carefully to the individual countries. I think that is a focus. I think that we also discussed before. That should be the emphasis. It's not about, you know, ruling, let's say, making decisions or ideas, wild ideas in Brussels or wild ideas elsewhere. Without the proper consultation mechanism. We see that within the processes, the Rabat process, Khartoum process, and indeed also the Joint Valletta Action Plan, many of these elements are being discussed, but not always do indeed the conclusions flow into operational activities and indeed operational partnerships.
Absolutely, and some of the results are positive and are not necessarily noticed, you know. I mean, in the area of capacity building, you know, as I said, in 2018, I think the European Union communicated a bit hastily on disembarkation mechanism, regional disembarkation mechanism, building on one proposal we had made with IOM. In reality, what is needed is to make sure that it's a shared responsibility by all countries. All coastal states need better capacity to manage irregular migration. When you see today, Tunisia is, for instance, the second country of disembarkation for people leaving Libya. Who knows that? In terms of numbers, that's quite substantial. You have had this year about 49,000 people leaving Libya by sea, but 52% ended up in Libya after because the Libyan operated interception and rescue. It's both interception and rescue because those boats are unseaworthy. So I think it's important to see that those efforts are paying off, but that's not enough, the maritime border. I mean, we need to be much more comprehensive and look at condition of entry, condition of stay, managing return. I mean, it's more comprehensive than sometimes what we would like to see.
Thank you. Then indeed, let's continue in that line. Let's focus on let's say, the land borders and between the Central Mediterranean countries and their southern neighbors. The Libyan Minister of Foreign Affairs recently had meetings with colleagues from Chad, Mali, Niger. There have been numerous other initiatives between countries in the region working on proper management of migration, both in the sense of facilitating more movements in the sense of the freedom of movement protocol. We have the ECOWAS freedom of movement, but we also have looked at border areas. Now we know how challenging the situation is, but how can we support efforts between countries to better cooperate and manage their borders and manage migration flows and make sure that we come to this vision of real legal migration and take the tools out of the hands of the smugglers. We looked a lot about the sea borders. What about the land borders and maybe the air borders?
No, absolutely. As far as the land borders are concerned, I think when you look at a country like Libya, there has been a deficit of the state in the southern part of the country, in the Fezzan province. So not enough state services, communities neglected, problem of coexistence between Arab tribe, Tebu and Tuareg communities. And with no economic prospect, I mean, all sorts of trade and illicit trafficking has become the real economy for those communities. So you need to go back to the basics, to the resilience of communities and build sustainable economy in that part of the country. Libya has concluded an agreement with 3 neighboring countries in June 2018, known as the Quartet Agreement. It has not been implemented. And it should not be just one-sided. It can't just be about combating irregular migration and returning people. There has to be a deal that is also beneficial to Niger, to Sudan, and Chad because of the large migrant communities they have in Libya. There could be a readmission of asylum seekers and refugees from Libya to neighboring countries because they'll be better protected in Niger, in Chad, and in Sudan than they are today in Libya, where we see a very difficult situation over the last couple of weeks. So I think we need to build on common interest, on not just the interest of Libya at this stage.
Okay. What about the air borders? Where do you see the arrivals there, and how does that affect also migration patterns?
Well, absolutely. Well, it's a sovereign prerogative to countries for countries to impose visa or not. But you know, when I'm, for instance, I'm based in Tunis, I see at the airport in Tunisia, I see people arriving from Guinea, from Ivory Coast. They're coming with absolutely no financial resources, no job prospect immediately in Tunisia. You know that those people, unfortunately, will end up being exploited on the labor market. And so we need to think about entry mechanisms that are effective, that prevent the trafficking of people. And Tunisia has a very good legislation in that respect. But with no effective screening at the entry, you know, whether you manage the maritime border or not, it doesn't solve the problem because the entry is not properly managed, nor the condition of stay. We've seen that during the COVID pandemic. We've seen large, invisible community coming out. And who was there to respond to their needs? Well, states were quite absent. Municipalities step in to provide the response.
Okay, and that's actually, we support since a number of years a program which indeed brings together cities around the Mediterranean, both on the European side, but in Jordan, but also in North African countries, where that part of the discussion, the role of municipalities, the role of cities in catering for migrants and their needs, and also communicating actually to the national population, the municipal populations on that issue. So I think it's interesting that you bring that forward, that you see that actually the role of the cities, despite sometimes different levels of authorities in the individual states, are so important. Now, we just listened carefully to what Madam Commissioner has said. We heard about the tripartite cooperation. If we think beyond this tripartite cooperation, where do you see other opportunities for cooperation? We heard about the centers in Rabat, Bamako, Khartoum, the 3 centers which are being proposed. Are there any other elements that you see where the African Union, African Union Commission, as well can play an important role in facilitating this management?
Well, on the advocacy front, I think the African Union has been more effective than ever on linking the political on the social dimension. I think the tripartite arrangement has worked to some extent for Libya. Now we have to look at the situation now, which is quite problematic. You know, all humanitarian flights have been suspended in Libya, so we need to go back in terms of joint advocacy with the Libyan authorities. But the African Union's role is critical in my view, looking at the root causes. In many international fora, we don't discuss the root causes of forced displacement. It's taboo. I think we need to look into that. There were times that, you know, we associated much more refugees, persons displaced to the solutions. What do they need to return home and to stay at home? Yes. Can they be part of the peace process? Can we negotiate amnesties to make people able to return in good conditions? And I think the African Union there can be more proactive. There are some solution process supported by the African Union or by sub-regional bodies like the IGAD. It's a Sudan, South Sudan solution process that needs to be supported by the international community, because Sudan is a key country on that route from East Horn of Africa. We have a solution strategy inside for the Ivorian refugee that affects all the countries in West Africa. We need support there.
Okay. Thank you. Now, one of the questions that we always is also talked about is the root causes. We have, working together with international financial institutions, with Austrian and German businesses, also supported by Germany. We started a program in Enugu where we would like to see how we can create a business community of European countries who invest concretely in a particular area in Africa, in this case in Enugu in Nigeria. Combine that with skills development, working with national universities, and then also seeing, okay, not only can those investors then find the people where they know they have the right skills for the work that needs to be implemented sur place, but also they create a pool of people whose skill could be used, let's say in European countries where more and more you hear that there's a labor shortage in specific areas. Is that something that you think is something that, you know, can be facilitated like this, or do we need something bigger? Is there bigger plans needed, or is it actually these kind of initiatives could inspire wider economic developments and also address root causes that are at the basis of many of the flows that we have heard?
No, I think skill development for the youth, be that for migrants or for refugees, is quite key on the whole debate about facilitated legal migration needs to happen. That's one of the components of the Valletta Plan of Action. We have not seen much development in this area, I think. So that needs to be supported. Now, are states the best place to facilitate that, or should we lead the business community do that?
Yes.
I often think that the business community is more able and understand better the needs and the dynamics of the labor market to put that in place. Pilot by pilot, project by project, country by country, but we need to start somewhere.
Exactly. I think for us, what's also the pilots, what we also see can inspire further initiatives, but also you can identify the weaknesses and the challenges that the countries are confronted with. We also see it with the lack in some countries with national employment institutions, to see how can we use them to actually establish international networks in this regard. Now, we have some 10 minutes left, and I would like to use them also for answering some of the questions. We have one question coming directly from the audience, but from the online audience. While answering that, I would like to invite you here in the room to also maybe see whether there's particular questions that you would like to ask, or issues that you actually would like to raise from your side, elements that you think might not have been covered. So also here I invite African countries present here today to maybe intervene. So the question that we got from the online audience is how can we imagine a migration partnership which is more aligned to the Southern partners' needs, as it says, is formulated here. How can we come to migration partnership discussion which is more aligned to the interests of the Southern partners?
I think first it starts with the recognition, like Commissioner Al-Fadil has said, first it starts with the recognition that most of the mixed migration are south-south. They are not south-north. And that we have to acknowledge, and it's not just a public acknowledgement, it's serious programming with a stabilizing value that needs to go in facilitating efforts to support mobility, to support host community, and also to recognize the gender dimension there. Because when we talk about mixed movement, we're talking about only 8% of women moving. Okay. It's, what do you do to compensate? It doesn't mean that they are not needing the same protection as some of the men on the move. So we need to also compensate for that.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you very much. While we, maybe I can later on go to another online question. Is there someone from the audience which would like to ask a question? Please raise your hand and introduce yourself. And the gentleman there. Once that you get the microphone.
Pillars are there. It's very clear. It's something negotiated and agreed upon. Of course, the issue is that we don't look at the 5 pillars in a holistic manner. I was myself in meetings, and we always, from the European side, we always push on readmission when we know it's a little bit more complicated, as we know. It's migration. There's a lot of migration south-south. There are the root causes, and of course, the legal pathways. So, but we welcome the spirit of partnership and the work undertaken by the EU, by the African Union and IOM and UNHCR on the 50,000 repatriated. And my point I wanted to make is on the situation in Libya. Whilst I was traveling here, we are following reports very concerning in Libya of what's happening. Although the departures have in August and September have gone down, but actually we're seeing consolidation of the armed groups. We see from Zawiya to Al-Wasya literally taken up by certain armed groups who are funding the new Naval Academy. We are seeing also the operation in Libya, in Tripoli, of 4,500 migrants who were put in the detention centers. Now they're bursting, 10,000. And I was wondering whether, of course, Libya, we need to fully acknowledge that the Libyans are doing what they can I mean, the country is passing through some very, very tough challenges. So in all this situation, how can, in your view, this partnership, EU, AU, IOM and UNHCR, what can they do to really contrast effectively this scourge, which is really impacting negatively Libya, Africa, and Europe? And the more people are making money, the more consolidated their operations become, and the more security challenges for everybody and for the people involved, because it's horrific seeing what is happening in detention centers. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yeah, very quickly we see a deterioration of the situation for migrants and refugees in Libya. I mean, it has never been as bad as it is now, frankly, in terms of access, in terms of treatment on racket in detention center. I'm talking about official detention center, in terms of ability to move people out of Libya. No, it's a very difficult situation. I understand it's not the top priority of the government. There is an electoral process, there is a stabilization process. It needs to happen for the benefit of the Libyan people and the neighbors of Libya. But at some stage, Libya needs to have a bit of a reality check. You know, the 600,000 migrants on its territory, as I say, 80% of them are working. Without them, the Libyan economy does not function. So at some stage, those people should stop to be exploited. They need work permit. Libya needs regular migration, needs circular migration with its neighboring country. ICMPD had produced a very good white paper with a roadmap for the Libyan authorities on that. At some stage, you have to implement part of that. It can't just be about return, about pushing people back to neighboring countries. That's not managed migration. But it's a difficult dialogue with the Libyan authorities, and I think we need to recognize that Europe has lost a bit of leverage in terms of its capacity to convince or influence the Libyan interlocutors. I think it's important for other players in Libya to speak up and to influence the current developments in Libya, because this is not going in the right direction. But maybe it has to deal with the election, the consolidation of powers by some, and so on.
Thank you very much, Vincent. I will take one more question from the room and then go back up. 2 more questions from the room. I've here Ambassador from Morocco, please, and then that gentleman.
First of all, I would like to thank you for inviting Mr. Vincent Coustel to interact with us in an important subject on migration and development. Well, I would like just to know what is the perspective of UNHCR with the situation, with this international debate on migrant and refugees. So migrant, today we have economic migrants, and refugees is clarified by the mandate of the UNHCR Convention of 1952, as you may know. So I want just to know what is your perspective with this volatile situation in the Sahel region. What will be the contribution of UNHCR in terms of, I can say, finding durable solution for people, for refugees, but not for migrants. It is another mandate from another organization, and how do you work with the other partnership for migration partnership and migration cooperation to solve this situation, this particular situation in North Africa and in the Sahel region? Thank you.
Vincent, please.
Well, I mean, there is no humanitarian solution for the Sahel region. If I'm looking at the crisis in Mali, in Burkina Faso, in Niger, in Nigeria, there is no humanitarian solution. I mean, we've been talking about the nexus, development, humanitarian aid. It's a quadruple nexus now all over the place. It's humanitarian response, development, security, and also migration management. All the four components have to be looked at because the situation in each country affects the neighboring country. So we need to be engaged, but we need to also look at the reality of the situation. Sometimes I see communiques about, you know, the return of the state in Mali, the return of the state in Burkina Faso. Well, both countries have lost control over the third of their territory, and it's not going better by the day. So we can dream about a better situation in the Sahel, but it's not happening on the ground. So what can be done in terms of stabilization, how we can beef up the capacity on the security partnership with neighboring countries, because the spillover effect is quite clear. Take a country like Niger, now it's constantly attacked by terrorist groups coming from Nigeria, coming from the Lake Chad region, coming from Burkina Faso and from Mali. I mean, there is existentially threat for some of those countries in the Sahel, and we cannot ignore them. So, you know, humanitarian response, we know how to do it with partner, but that's not sufficient. You need to restore a sense of protection, a sense of the state presence in remote parts of these countries.
Thank you very much. Gentleman in the back, please.
Thank you. Roberto Forin from the Mixed Migration Center. Thanks, Commissioner, for inspiring and quite alternative perspective. And thank you for the very interesting panel conversation. One thing that I was a bit surprised not to hear or not to see a bit more highlighted in the discussion we are having today is the situation of mixed migration flow from Burkina Faso and Mali toward coastal countries. Something that as a mixed migration center together with UNHCR we have been studying last year, because there we really see a sort of situation where different drivers of migration, conflict, climate change, they intertwine and they create this movement over coastal country. And we know that is something that is not as highlighted, is a bit overlooked in the discussion that tend to be focusing a bit more on the northern part of the Sahel, let's say. What do you think? Don't you think that is something that should be perhaps discussed a bit more and that should be a bit having a more prominent role in the discussion of migration flow toward Europe?
Thank you, Roberto. Please.
Well, we have a lot of hope that the Observatory on Migration based in Rabat of the African Union will produce some of that evidence-based approach and route-based approach that will enable us to know more about South-South movement. Because when young people, sometimes children from Burkina Faso, go to Ghana or go to Ivory Coast to work in the cacao fields, we think, well, they are economic migrants. Nobody asked them whether they were displaced because of the war in Burkina Faso before. So, you know, I'm warning a bit against categorization of people. Let's not assume anything. Let's try to document who are those people and what are the best response for them. I think data is lacking.
Thank you. Before ending, I would like to take one more question which came from the online audience. When the European Pact on Migration was presented last year, the commissioners made a great effort to say there is different pillars. And one of the main pillars was the external dimension. And the question concretely here is, what is the impact of the current intra-EU discussions on asylum and migration on the external dimension ambitions? And I think here is indeed an interesting tension, because we see that despite progress with the move from EASO to the European Union Asylum Agency, which was a big step forward, on many other files we see lack of progress. Do you see how that standstill, or may not call it standstill, let's say slow progress with regard to the pact, has an impact on the external dimension ambitions of the European Union?
Yes, clearly in North Africa, I think there is a fear in North Africa that the lack of progress of the pact or a certain vision of the pact could lead to a transfer of responsibility towards them. So I think we need to be very careful in making sure that the pact brings added value, including for partners, and does not lead to that perception of transfer of responsibility. I think when you look at all the North African countries, all of them have signed the refugee instrument for many, many years. None of them have national legislation in place today. And they fear that if they would develop national legislation, they would attract more people, which is, in my view, the wrong way to approach it. But we need better tools to manage that. But I think we are in a period where it's difficult to engage a discussion with North African partners on that priority, although they need better migration management in all its dimensions, as we said, on entry, on condition of stay, but also on return.
Yes. Thank you very much. I think that sets an ambitious agenda. And I would like to thank Vincent Cochetel for his very relevant and important insights. And I think now we can go for lunch. So thank you very much, Vincent.
Thank you.
Thank you.